Today we are going to be doing the case studies that will form the backbone of this volume that we're doing together, and also I hope will be the backbone of some of the well, hopefully it'll provide us with material to really think through the accountability question. We're obviously focusing on health. As we heard yesterday from Majid, accountability can cross a number of spheres, but really we're going to focus on health today with cases on TB and cholera and Ebola. So what Aaron and I, Aaron, Tom, Adme, and I have done in this whole in putting this together is we've tried to think, is there a way that we could bring in some different reflections that will push our thinking of accountability? Because yesterday the word punishment came up, ideas of accountability, punishment, accountability for what? How do you actually hold people accountable? What is the relationship between reconciliation, accountability, and reparations, and a whole variety of things came up yesterday. That in private discussions and public discussions, etc. And so when we were trying to put this together, we thought, why don't we bring somebody that has nothing to do with health, but can really help us think about ideas of liberalism and how we're framing some of these problems. And so we've put in we've invited our friend and colleague Professor Faisal Devji from Oxford University. And Faisal is a historian who specializes in Islam, globalization, violence, and ethics. And his work grounds empirical historical issues in philosophical questions. He's taught at the New School. He is now a university reader in modern South Asian history at Oxford University and a senior fellow in the Institute for Public Knowledge at New York University and the Yves Ultramar Chair at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva. He's also taught at Yale. If you're going to say something bad about him, don't say it in English, French, Gujarati, Hindi, Kutchi, Kojki, Swahili, Persian, Sindhi, or Urdu, because he's quite the polyglot. And he's written a number of very important books that are, I think are amongst the most brilliant that I've read. Landscapes of the Jihad, Militancy, Morality and Modernity, The Terrorist in Search of Humanity, Militant Islam and Global Politics, The Impossible Indian, Gandhi, and The Temptation of Violence. And today he's going to give us a framing lecture just to give us food for thought called Gandhi's Intervention, Life, Liberalism, and the Pursuit of Equity. So Faisal Devji, please.
Well, thank you very much, Salman, and thank you all. I really am here under false pretenses and had to be persuaded rather vigorously to attend. So I hope what I'll say is of some small interest. I don't share any of the specialization in the field, obviously, that the rest of you do. So what I thought I'd do today is speak about 4 moments in the history of humanity as a modern category, and then end with a kind of critique of the category itself by Gandhi. So the whole talk is not going to be a kind of genuflection to the Mahatma. It might end up being that towards its finish. I thought I'd started by suggesting that even though the critique, the journalistic, but also to some degree the academic critique of humanitarianism and humanitarian intervention in particular tends to be defined by its politicization. Right, that states intervene not for truly humanitarian causes, but for other rather more unsightly ones that have to do with the geopolitics and oil and resources and many other things besides. And while this is probably true, what I'd like to suggest is that it's also not necessarily relevant. More interesting is the fact that such interventions in the name of humanity tend to be anti-political in nature, that they close down, that they shut down the arena of politics altogether, and by privileging a kind of moral imperative. So if you're going to critique anything, it is the moral imperative which legitimizes such interventions. It's not the politics that justifies the interventions. However hypocritical this situation, I think it really behooves us to consider the role that moral imperatives have played in the history of humanitarianism and of the making of humanity as a category in its own right. And I'd like to trace this to imperialism, not an entirely novel suggestion on my part, because of course the European empires, especially in the 19th, towards the end of the 18th and the 19th and the early 20th centuries, precisely because they were not legitimized in political terms, certainly not in democratic or liberal terms, though they were liberal very often at home, could only be justified in moral terms. And of those moral terms, the defense of humanity and humanitarianism were absolutely central. All you have to do is think about abolition and the debate over abolition in Britain, and the abolition of slavery, of course. And as you know, what resulted from it was there was an internal debate in Britain. What resulted from it was a kind of politics of the moral imperative, which allowed Britain to flout international law such as it was in that period, to impound ships carrying slave cargoes, etc., all of which, of course, is a good thing. But all of this was also made possible in a way by Britain's world empire. It's only that which allowed Britain to behave in this manner, but also allowed Britain to foreground humanity and humanitarianism as its own particular field and focus. And I'll come back to that in a bit. Why should it have been England rather than any other place that was at the forefront of abolition, considered here as one of the earliest and most important examples of a humanitarian, if you will, intervention. Of course, replete with its own hypocrisies, because we know indenture replaces slavery. And we know that slave owners were compensated in an absurdly disproportionate way, and the slaves weren't at all, right? So taking all that together. But before coming to abolition and why England stands at the forefront of the humanitarian enterprise, I'd like to just finish up with this imperial history of humanitarian intervention and how it's linked to a kind of anti-political impetus. On the one hand, as I suggested, imperialism has to be legitimized by a moral imperative precisely because a liberal or democratic or any other form of political imperative doesn't exist. The humanitarian imperative is sovereign, defined by sovereignty, and therefore exceptional by definition, because it's based upon necessity, the logic of necessity. It's not based upon consultation, free discussion, representation, any of those things, elections, etc., etc. It's all about a rhetoric of urgency, and we see this over and over again to our day. The rhetoric of urgency that impelled the invasion of Iraq, for instance. We don't have time, we need to do it. They will die, or even worse, we will die if we don't. All subtended by this, if you will, even Kantian sense of the moral imperative. And that form of sovereign action, of course, is one that belongs peculiarly to the modern state. Now, to return to England and her world empire, the rather controversial German jurist Carl Schmitt actually notes this probably earliest in the interwar period, when he notes how it is precisely because the English world empire has no territorial integrity, it's dispersed across the world, that humanity becomes an important category for it. It doesn't have any piece of territory to defend. It is focused in its defense maneuvers entirely and strangely on routes, on canals, on isthmuses, on sea lanes, on the things that connect up bits of its empire. So it has, curiously, despite or perhaps because it possesses such a large empire, it has no integrity, it has no territorial conception of it. And it must therefore, in his view, speak in the name of a kind of world entity like the human race, humanity, which the empire seeks to promote or protect or etc. And therefore he thinks that it is precisely England that stands at the forefront of these ways of thinking, which is why, for instance, as I was suggesting earlier, abolition becomes so important for it. It is the lack of integrity, in other words, of territorial and political integrity that allows for Britain, colonial imperial Britain, to put forward humanitarianism and humanitarian intervention in our terms as it's one of its chief forms of exercising rule. All right. In Schmidt's view, interestingly, the US, the rival and rising power, is not initially defined in this fashion. And he points to the Monroe Doctrine of the earlier 19th century, where, as you will recall, the United States reserves the Americas, basically, eventually an entire hemisphere, for its own suzerainty. It doesn't claim to be protecting the globe or humanity, or it doesn't make those kinds of claims. It takes a large chunk of the globe and puts it under U.S. Suzerainty. But according to Schmidt, what happens after the First World War and the making of an international order for the first time, that includes other places, right? Japan, of course, and others, is that the US actually ends up abandoning its own doctrine to fall in with the British imperial one, and so accedes to this idea of the defense of humanity, humanitarian interventions and protections and all the rest, and therefore gets rid of the juridical and political pluralism that had characterized earlier, however violently, earlier forms of what one might call anachronistically international relations, and certainly America's own form of stressing its dominance through something like the Monroe Doctrine. With the end of the First World War as well, you have emerging new categories which are still with us, re-emerging, like just war tradition, which of course is medieval. It comes out of medieval Christianity. And it's come back with a bang after 9/11, perhaps even from slightly before then. And according to Schmidt, one of the things this does is to eliminate the possibility of neutrality and therefore the autonomy of politics itself. And he had pointed out how neutrality in the international order had played a very important role in balancing out, in allowing for discussions to take place, and in preventing the slide of the whole world into either a war or into some form of global bifurcation. Because the moment you have neutral states, you can't have a kind of either-or politics happening. And what results, in his view, then, is a kind of dehumanization in the name of humanity. Because once you have that, once you clear the decks, as it were, you disallow for politics in all these ways that I have described, then humanity really becomes the only imperative, which has the consequence, in Schmidt's view, of consigning your enemies to inhuman status. You have to dehumanize them. If your politics is based on humanity, your enemy, by definition, must not be fully human. So strangely and paradoxically, the recourse to humanity in this period results in the dehumanization of others. And this is clear. It's clear how this happens, and that tradition is still with us. All right. So these are some of the paradoxes of the language of humanity and humanitarianism and humanitarian interventions that start becoming clear in the interwar period. All right. So I've said something about the British World Empire and humanitarianism and humanitarian interventions as part of an imperial project, not only, obviously, part of an imperial project, but very linked to it, and then talked about the interwar period, the period after the First World War, when the idea starts getting legal legs, as it were. Right? Now I want to just move on very quickly to talk about in the Second World War and after, when humanity becomes a kind of potential agent for the first time. So this is a category that had previously been seen very often as simply a kind of regulative principle, right? No one actually thought humanity existed as an actor in its own right. Once, of course, you have cartography and demography come into play, again, in imperial societies, when you can measure and count them all up and you can actually come to a relatively exact, it becomes an empirical reality for the first time. Prior to this, humanity was a kind of, as I put it, a regulative ideal. It becomes empirical precisely in this period, and in the League of Nations period, in a way. And therefore, it becomes possible to think of it as an agent in its own right. That what humanity wants to do, what it intends, can it act? Can the human race actually act? It's an extraordinary thought to consider, I think. And Hannah Arendt, who I want to move on to now, actually writes about this in the post-Second World War period, in particular, where she notes, following the German philosopher Karl Jaspers, that after the Second World War, humanity, which had been the ideal of the League of Nations world, inherited from the British World Empire, was now available only in negative form as shame. And she famously puts it, all we have today to bind us together as human beings is the shame of being human, that we could have tolerated what happened with Nazism and fascism during the war. It has no political form of its own. And it's a very prescient thing she says there. So, we inherited this language of humanity and humanitarianism. It collapsed, basically, during the war. And now we are faced with something that is an existential or a phenomenological fact in some ways. We feel that we are part of something called the human race. We suddenly have started thinking of humanity as if it were a potential subject that can act in its own name. But there's nothing, it's a negative form. There's nothing, it is not a political subject. She then points out that humanity, in a way, comes to exist only after the atom bomb, in the possibility of its own extinction. Right? So it's like, how does this figure of the human race, of humanity, become real in our times after the Second World War? Well, one way it becomes real is in the shame that she points to after the Second World War, but more importantly, perhaps, the possibility of a nuclear conflagration suddenly makes apocalypse come back to modern history for the first time in about 200 years. What had been dismissed as a theological category, apocalypse, I mean, that's religion, isn't it? It comes back with full force, with the possibility of a nuclear extinction, nuclear winter, all of these things that we know about. And one of the consequences of this comeback is that we can now conceive of the extinction of the human race itself in, as it were, empirical scientific terms and not in religious terms. The religious element is obviously still there because the apocalypse has returned. And what this means is, what this allows us to do is think about the human race as a political figure or as a potential agent, but only retrospectively, posthumously. And of course, there's a long philosophical tradition in Western Europe by which it's someone like Heidegger, with whom Arendt worked, where the individual human being too realizes him or herself as human precisely because he or she is conscious of death. All right, so it's a kind of being towards death, and so there's a strange way in which the way in which humanity is conceived of in individual terms, the humanity of individual persons, is mapped onto this large thing called the human race, which is similarly construed in the shadow of nuclear war and possible extinction. What nuclear war also does, in Arendt's view, is make old-fashioned sacrifice impossible, because, as she points out, in previous wars, you could always sacrifice your life, you could sacrifice yourself, because you assume the continuity of your people, your race, your nation, your civilization, whatever it is, your religion. and your sacrifice would redound to its credit. All right, it would contribute to its survival. The problem with nuclear war is that it would destroy everything. So it made sacrifice as a fundamental virtue, political or religious virtue, impossible. What would it mean to sacrifice the entire human race? So the human race, rather than being the kind of dark matter that's always just there, for which you can sacrifice, as you can sacrifice for your country, etc., suddenly becomes fully conscious. So she's basically tracking the way in which the human race potentially becomes a subject or becomes subjectivized, posthumously, as I've argued, but also in this fashion. Nuclear war allows us to think these new things. And she says something quite interesting. She says, the thing about life as something that defines humanity, it's quite new. Because traditionally, of course, life is what you sacrifice. To be really human, you sacrifice your life, or to be really whatever it is, a citizen or something. And we still have that thought. Because life is only sacred for the gods. Because the gods are immortal. The gods cannot sacrifice themselves. Men can sacrifice because they die anyway. The thing about being human is you know that you're going to die. This is the essence of your humanity. Gods don't die. Gods or the god, all right, doesn't die. So when you sacrifice as a human being, you're just hastening, you're making a choice to give your life over. Your life is going to go anyway. If you were a god, you could never give up your life because you don't die, right? So life is actually a virtue, an absolute moral virtue, an absolute principle only for divine beings. And Arendt points out that in the shadow of nuclear catastrophe, men become gods in this way, because you can no longer consider sacrificing by an act of nuclear brinksmanship the entire human race, to say nothing of other species, right? So in a strange and paradoxical fashion, the moment the human race becomes a potential subject by becoming potentially posthumous, it takes on the character of a god, or it becomes divine. And what that results in, or one of the implications of that statement, in her view, is that life becomes the ultimate principle. So humanity and life are linked in this manner. And sacrifice becomes, even though it's still there, obviously you can die for your country and all the rest. It is de-emphasized. It loses a great deal. And I want to note how humanity in this new way, this kind of posthumous figure, a potential subject, is linked to life as the ultimate principle of value, the ultimate value, formerly a value only for gods, not for human beings. Right? And how that might play out in contemporary discussions of intervention, etc. Now I'd like to go on to my final moment in the history of humanity and then say something about Gandhi. And this has to do with, so I've talked about the imperial origins, I've talked about the sort of interwar period and the making of the international order with the League of Nations, and where humanitarianism resides there. I've said something about the Cold War, the post-Second World War period, and what happens to the figure of humanity as a potential agent. And I want to talk about the post-Cold War period and the period of globalization and what happens, what is the fate of this figure of the human there. I mean, I think the interesting thing about the term globe, one of the interesting things about it is that it has no context apart from itself. So if you think about the world is always part of a context, which is this world, the other world, this worldliness, otherworldliness. You don't even have to think of different worlds. It's part of a traditional order, right? It's a cosmological principle in a way. The Earth similarly belongs within the galaxy, etc. Earth, planet, all of these things have their own kinds of context. The globe is the only one that doesn't. It doesn't have a context. When we talk about the globe, we only mean the Earth. We don't mean other planets. it's deprived of a context, and therefore it has, as a consequence, humanity as its simultaneous, I want to argue, subject and object. You can't think of other worlds, you can't think of other species as in science fiction, you can't think of God, you can't think of any of those things. The way we discuss global problems and globalization, whether it's climate change, whether it is pandemics, whether it is always about itself. And about itself implies the dominance of humanity as the simultaneous subject and object of the globe, all right? Subject because humanity suddenly starts acting, assumes the position of an agent, even if only metaphorically. When we think about, things like, think of the moon landing, one of the earliest moments where you actually you become global by leaving the Earth. Of course, we know who did it. It's the Americans and all the rest. But by implication, you can say this is, as Neil Armstrong did, a small step for man and a leap for mankind. Is that the thing? Where he actually invokes the figure of humanity, right? Because after all, this is an event so stupendous that it cannot simply be predicated of something as small as a nation, however important. So I want to just point out how the idea of the globe and globalization gives humanity a particular kind of role, or humanity takes on a particular kind of role in it. And the problem then becomes, how do you actually deal with this? The absence of a context is very interesting because it reduces all political and other action to the confines of the globe, even for religious groups. So if you look at, and I have written about this somewhat extensively, Al-Qaeda, which interestingly adopts a kind of generic rhetoric of humanity and humanitarianism, all right? So Al-Qaeda saw the Muslim community as a global fact, itself a new way of thinking, standing in for, as a vanguard for the human race itself, which it sought to protect from the depredations of evil Western powers on the one hand, but also from global corporations and capitalism. It's quite interesting. It's a bunch of cliches that they bring together in their rhetoric. And you might think that a religious movement, or one that makes such heavy recourse to religion, should at least be able to conceive of a context beyond the globe, but they don't. They refer to God and things all the time, but in a way, it's entirely apart from the kind of recourse to dreams and things. It's a world entirely deprived of a context. It is purely global in that respect, which is why it can speak of humanity and for humanity in this fashion. And indeed, the philosopher Adi Ophir, now teaching at Brown, has written a very nice paper on how the terrorist and the humanitarian go together in so many ways. They operate in a similar fashion, in a sacrificial fashion, in defense of ideals. They are both interventionist. They have a global perspective. They don't think only about particular states and all the rest. It is global, right? They refer to very similar issues as well. Bin Laden constantly talked about climate change, for instance, right? It's about spectacle, right? There's a kind of the spectacularization of humanitarianism, both in the way of humanitarian interventions militarily, but also, and Ophir points to MSF, for instance, which is an admirable, or in my view, organization, but which needs to operate in this way as well. You parachute into a country, you don't really know much about it, you learn about it, you go in there, you do your stuff, humanitarian stuff. It needs to be broadcast in some way because you need to have attention and you need to get funds, and then you move on to something else, right? He basically describes how the figure of the terrorist, the global Islamic terrorist, follows almost the same kind of model, and also depends upon the rhetoric of victimization, right? So obviously I'm not making a moral equivalence here. All I'm suggesting, and all Adi Ofer is suggesting, is that the context in which we operate is sufficiently ambiguous or sufficiently universal as to allow all kinds of people and movements to use the same kind of language, all right? And indeed, one of the problems of terrorism in our age is that, you know, we are forced to, and they themselves, the terrorists, precisely because they share so much in the way of rhetorics and language and presuppositions, can only maintain their differences in these kinds of bizarre, you know, either by dressing and strange forms of language or by excessive forms of violence. And those are all ways in which to actually obscure, in a way, the strange familiarity that otherwise obtains between them. Now, Ophir argues that both, and this is a positive point that he's making, that both the humanitarian worker and the terrorist require the sovereign state, to extend rights to others in a unilateral way without the contract of citizenship. So what they're demanding is the end of the old internationalist order. They want states, in this case, to extend rights to others, whether or not these others are citizens, in violation of international rules and norms. And in doing so, of course, they put into question citizenship itself. Now, these questions, of course, have come back to us in another form in our contemporary debate on migration and refugees. When Ophir was writing, he was writing about humanitarian intervention or aid on the one hand and terrorist activism on the other. But you can see similar things happening. Do you let all those people into Germany who are on the borders? Yes, 1 million were let in. Does that put into question the contract of citizenship, the citizenship that is based upon a contract between citizens and the state? You can see how the debates over refugees all over Europe involve this, right? Why? And very often immigrants themselves, former immigrants, saying, you know, well, we worked hard and we immigrated legally, and look at these guys just being let in. And now, we might dismiss all of that properly, but actually there's something to be aware of here, these debates, crude as they sometimes are, allow us to think about the consequences of these kinds of interventions and imperatives, how they actually are pulling apart the old contractual idea of citizenship by calling, they don't get rid of the state. It's interesting. It's not about we get rid of all states, and it's about extending rights beyond citizenship and beyond the state itself in a way that's interestingly not interventionist, right? In particular where it regards migration, flows of people. So having gone through all that, I'd just, like to say a few words about Gandhi's critique. And of course, all I've said so far is simply skimming on the surface because, it's a lengthy time period I've been dealing with, and I just wanted to just light upon certain issues which I hope might be of some small interest. So Gandhi is quite interesting because he, from the very beginning, rejects any attempt to speak in the name of humanity. He thinks this is an imperialist category. As early as in 1908, 1909, in his first book, in Swaraj, written while he was still in South Africa, he basically says, look, I don't want to speak in the name of humanity. That takes away from the politics that's only possible within in circumscribed spaces, right? Indeed, the idea of humanity is linked. He links it to technology. So we can only consider this sort of thing, this figure, as being capable of being, as one capable of being, say, served or protected because of trains and shipping and telegraph and all of these things. He understands that very well. He says this is the world of the imperial state. The imperial state speaks about humanity, and it's linked to capitalist technology, and so that's all a bad thing, right? He doesn't like it. He thinks that the distinction between the universality of the human on the one hand and the particularity of individual nation states is a false one. because, of course, particularity and universality begin together. They're part of the same economy. They're not alternatives to each other. But how do you actually refuse the universal in this way? He's interested in what I might call non-universality, right? He's saying, look, these claims to universalism and universality are not only deeply hypocritical, they're actually imperialist and premised upon capitalist technology. But we can't get rid of it altogether, obviously. So how do you deal with it? Well, one way of doing so is to refuse to speak of humanity as a positive form altogether. So he just does not go down the road that I've just been mapping, which is about how the human race becomes a potential subject. It is deprived of positive form and deprived of history to make it a kind of strange negative phenomenon. And Gandhi is indeed quite keen on negatives. If you think about his terminology, ahimsa, non-violence, non-cooperation, he loves these negative forms. And he thinks that non-violence is precisely a negative form because the positive form involves violence. It involves a kind of imperative that is violent by definition. And the thing about non-violence is that it's literally invisible. It's not universal, but it's ubiquitous. Everything depends upon it, but it cannot be formalized into something visible and agential, something that can act. All right? That's the role of violence. And violence makes itself felt in universalism, he thinks, right? In this period anyway. And for him, humanitarianism, so he's against speaking about the human race as a positive figure or speaking for it. He thinks that is imperious. He refuses to do it. He only spoke about subjects when he was invited to, right? He would never otherwise presume to say anything about them. But he's for something called, he quite likes humanitarianism. But what does he mean by humanitarianism? He thinks it actually means going beyond the human. He rejects this idea of basing humanitarian activity on similitude, on likeness. For instance, the commonplace rhetoric, they are just like us. They look just like us. They have our names. We need to help them. He thinks this is actually quite a racist logic. They are like us, and therefore we are somehow connected. We need to, and he thinks, okay, the idea of the human beings as being like each other is only the kind of universalized form of what becomes, it's the same logic as a racist logic, which is to say, we only help people who are like us, right? So how do you think about the human deprived of this logic of similitude, of likeness? What does that mean? Well, one of the ways he does this is by thinking beyond across species. So he takes a kind of traditional Hindu conception of cow protection, very controversial in his own day, as indeed today, where people are getting lynched on the basis of whether they supposedly eat beef or not in India. And he says, look, the thing about extending protection to the cow, who just stands in for other species, right, for Gandhi, is that it is an act which is, on the one hand, sovereign and unilateral, like states are sovereign and unilateral, but these are individual acts, right, because he takes sovereignty away from the state and vests it in the individual. But the thing about them is that they're not based on anything about similitude and likeness. The whole point of dealing with an animal in an ethical fashion is that you cannot communicate with it. It's not like you, right? You don't share food with it necessarily, all right? You don't marry it. So these are all ways in which we define human relations. Can you marry each other? Do you share food? Is commensality? Can you speak? Language, of course, is one of the traditional definitions of what being human is. Can you communicate? He thinks these are all, at bottom, what I'm calling sort of racist logics, because it's the same logic of likeness that is big, at the human level, but at a smaller level becomes highly discriminatory. So his point about humanitarianism is that it must somehow exit the species loyalty and must not depend on all these ideas of similitude and likeness. And what he ends up doing, and I'll close, is to displace life as a value. And you will recall I spoke about how life becomes an ultimate value in this paradoxical fashion, as a kind of divine thing, with truth. So he's rejected this idea of humanity and similitude. He now wants to displace life as the value that defines humanity altogether with truth, which allows life to be sacrificed. Right? So Gandhi was not a pacifist, for instance. He did support a war on occasion. And his unilateral and sovereign acts of nonviolence were premised, unlike those of the state, which come from a position of strength, or in which you sacrifice yourself for a higher power. What Gandhi does with sovereignty is you sacrifice, the strong sacrifices for the weak rather than the weak for the strong. All right. So your sacrifice is humanitarian because you are willing to sacrifice. Not obviously life is the final point, but there are many other things you can sacrifice before that for someone who is not equal to you. That's why the cow also becomes important. The cow is to be protected not because she's a goddess, but because the cow can easily be killed. The cow is not equal to you. It's not a language of equality that he's basing his humanitarianism on. And I'll give you a couple of anecdotes. There was, in 1937, one of Hitler's newspaper editors, Rudolf von Strunk, who had been in charge of funneling arms to the fascists during the Spanish Civil War, interestingly came to see Gandhi just before the war in India. And he was interested in Gandhi's experiments in health. And of course, you can understand why the Nazis were interested in these experiments in health and life and all the rest. And he meets Gandhi, and Gandhi asks him about the Spanish Civil War, and he says, "Oh, no, violence, it's terrible," and all the rest. And Gandhi says, "No, you don't understand. I really admire the way you Europeans are willing to throw away your lives. That is truly admirable. That's extraordinary. What I don't understand is why you seek to preserve it so ferociously." He says, "Now you have all of these medicines, these forms of medical assistance that allow you to prolong life. But don't you understand that this prolongation of life is directly related to its destruction? That it's precisely because you're so focused on improving life. Of course, the fascists have their own idea of what improving life means, and preserving it, that you're willing to destroy others to achieve that for your own group." On the one hand, of course, he's critical of the way in which animals are sacrificed and, in his view, tortured for medical experiments. On the other hand, he uses the word subhuman very crucially because, of course, this is a Nazi word as well, which links the animal life of the kind that is sacrificed in medical experiments to human beings considered as parasites and subhuman, as the Nazis considered a number of people, right? So he makes a quite interesting rhetorical gesture there and says, look, this violence, it's terribly violent, but it's entirely linked to your making of life the ultimate value, the ultimate principle. If you were to only focus on throwing away your life, sacrificing it in non-violent ways, then you were in a different situation altogether. So it's typical Gandhi, slightly wacky, of course, but in a way, the point is an interesting one. What he's saying is that you must understand that the focus on life as the ultimate value is highly problematic. The fascists can do it, and the liberals can do it. And it's not like he doesn't want people to live good lives. Gandhi is constantly engaged in medical experimentation himself. But he thinks that life cannot be an ultimate value. And you must actually consider the kinds of violence that promoting such a value entail. And then my final anecdote, which has to do with Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Gandhi is also against those. So Julian Huxley at UNESCO, who's in charge of circulating. So he writes to all of these eminent people, Einstein, etc., to ask for their ideas about what should go into the making of the the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And Gandhi is on a train and writes back and says, actually, I'm not so much a supporter of rights. I think they're quite a bad thing. Because, of course, rights are not or never inalienable as you think they are. Rights are given by states and they're taken away by states. No one actually possesses them. They mark a deep hierarchy. In a way, this is similar to an Arendtian position of the right to have rights. Duties, on the other hand, belong to individuals. No one can take away your duty. That you own, that's yours. So you can be committed to duty in a way that you can never really be committed to rights because you never really own them. To advocate for rights is always to be in the position of a beggar, to like, please give us our rights. Why have you taken away our rights? So the thing that's meant to be inalienable never is. Duty is what is inalienable, and he wants to begin from there. How do you begin from the individual rather than beginning from the top down with the language of rights? Now, obviously, Gandhi doesn't believe that you should have no structure of law, that people should not be treated equally and all the rest. But it's another kind of point he's making. He also points out that whereas the primary right is the right to life, the primary duty is the duty of death, to die, to sacrifice. And he thinks that that is something all individuals have within their power as well. And if you were to start from the position of duty and sacrifice, morally speaking, you would be able to go much further in a different direction than if you began with rights and life. And all this, not in order to dispose of lives, obviously, not in order to create violence, but the opposite. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
So we have invited a respondent for Faisal to really, try and think about how this pertains to our discussions here. And so the respondent today is going to be Dr. Andrew McDowell, who was a graduate student here in the Department of Anthropology. And Andy is currently a fellow at the medical school in the Department of Global Health and Social Medicine and at the French National Center for Scientific Research. And French people are really into this this kind of thing. I'm joking. So we thought that it would be best, if Andrew gave some comments. And Andrew works on subjectivity, care, and experience within global bureaucracies. He's focused on tuberculosis. And so, Andrew, let me let you say a few words.
Great.
Do you want to come up? Why don't you come up?
Yeah, I'll come up.
Yeah.
What to do with all these things. Okay. Can I sit by you?
Yes,
Do
of
you
course.
mind? So I think this is really fascinating for what we talked about yesterday, because I think by showing I think you've showed really beautifully that what we're trying to kind of do here is inject politics or accountability into something which is, by your estimation, rather anti-political. Right? So you go through this really beautiful history of humanity as an imperialist drive that's tied to time and space, sort of ways that people are deferred through time, through space, and so beautifully lay out that the kind of beginning of On the Human Condition, where she also says, we know that we are global because we have a rocket that went and left,
Yes,
right?
yeah.
So this sort of decontextualization, and I wanted to sort of ask you to think a little, or just not even think, but tell me what you think about this argument about decontextualization that you make, right? Because for me, if I think about concepts like law, like justice, like freedom, these are also radically decontextualized, right? So if we're gonna join a project of injecting politics where there is not politics, might decontextualization not be such a terrible thing after all? I think that's my sort of first big question that I would love to talk about with you. The second thing is this really wonderful sort of bit you've pulled out from Gandhi in this question of the citizen and the right and the duty. So if, as you so beautifully pointed out, humanitarian model is a sovereign model, but not really a governance model, then what happens to this question of rights anyway, right? Are we sort of like is it apples and oranges if there is no sort of governmentality involved? How can one say one has a right that can be taken away when the other side of your argument says that there's no right anyway because the sovereign is the only one who has the right? So that, to bring back to our accountability conversation, would, I think, say, like, who do we make our claims to in the world of a sovereign that is extraterrestrial, right? So how does one make a claim in an anti-politics machine? I don't know if that makes a lot of sense. I've just sort of been trying to think of things to say for the last half hour. So tomorrow we can talk more. So the last thing I wanted to kind of ask you about is really poorly handwritten here. So this question of displacing the value of life with the value of truth. So can you just, I work in India, so I actually should know this, but I don't think a lot of folks knew what Gandhi meant when he said truth. Because I think he was actually saying something a bit different than what we would maybe think of as truth, and particularly if we're going to talk about politics, right? So if Gandhi says that the answer one should displace the sort of life with truth, and I imagine you're talking about how Arendt is also suggesting that life is the only thing one is required to do. So then what is the truth here? And do we need to think about what the truth is if we're talking about accountability at all for global health? And how do we do that when you've made such a beautiful argument that the context doesn't exist, right? So these are my kind of just the quick things that I was trying to work through as you were speaking. The other sort of final thing, because I'm sure you have lots more to say than I do, is this question of the mortal and the immortal, right? So I thought it was beautiful how you lay out how humanity goes from the mortal to the actor, from the immortal to the actor to the mortal, and follow Arendt's through that as well. But then again, we end up with something which is not just life, right? We end up with something that can be all of these three things at once. And if it can be all these three things at once, then to evoke the word that we evoked before we sort of abruptly left yesterday, what is punishment? If something can be mortal, immortal, and an actor, then is punishment is it even something worth talking about? And what might that look like? Does that make any sense at all?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. No, thank you very much. I mean, I think in terms of context, yeah, you're exactly right. I mean, Arendt, I didn't speak about it, but for Arendt, as you know, the important thing about one of the important consequences of the nuclear bomb is that it potentially makes everyone else's neighbor. Because something happening in some faraway part of the world in which you have no connection, with which you have no connection, no context, might result in your death, or, it's not only nuclear bomb, it could be anything. That's how pandemics work, that's how global warming works. It might not be your fault, you might not be connected to this history at all, but you're still affected by it. And for her, it's fascinating because it makes a global context possible, all right? But it makes it possible in a distinctively new way because there's no shared history. So everyone is your neighbor for all these reasons, because of climate change and because of nuclear potential catastrophe and pandemics and all the rest. But you have no prior history together, necessarily. Nothing actually else connects you apart from the disaster itself. So what does it mean to talk about context in this manner? So I suspect, on the one hand, you're right, there's a critique of this kind of global context as, in fact, not a context at all. It's entirely random, all right? So I suppose the task would be, if it were possible, to reduce that randomness, to actually make history possible, to make connections possible. And that is to say, to make freedom, choice, consultation, voice, all of these things possible, as they are not otherwise, because the setting up of a global context in this manner presumes what I started out with, which is to say it belongs to the realm of necessity. It's about an imperative. It's about emergency. It's not about politics in the sense that politics might be thought of as a site for freedom. It is not about debate. It's not about discussion. It's not about any of those things. But sometimes the emergency itself allows for thinking. So the if you want to call it an emergency, the global crisis of refugees today sort of forces that thinking. One has to excavate the histories that actually connect up people. You have one now has to understand, and it's being done in the press every day. Well, hang on, it's not simply a history of who did what. If you hadn't bombed there, then there wouldn't have been these guys, and if Syria had. That's a kind of fake genealogy. It's a legalistic. It's good for legal reasons, but in a way to show how Western Europe has always been connected to, say, the Near East. What is that history? How does this influx of refugees actually not come out of nowhere? That it actually reinvokes, especially the paths they take. It's fascinating. So, very often in the period before the Hungarians clamped down and all, when you have, these flows going through the Balkans and through Eastern, it was reopening Ottoman type routes. It was for a historian, a fascinating thing that was happening. It was the making visible of histories that we had thought were dead and gone. And that happens all the time. So in a way, the emergency provides room for a kind of connecting up that Arendt thought was necessary for freedom to exist, because freedom cannot exist when there's only the language of necessity and emergency and imperatives and all the rest, right? So how do you make a global context into a historical context? And in a way, I think that also to some degree addresses your third point about truth, because for Gandhi, again, the focus on life is, as with Arendt, curiously, it's about the realm of necessity and what she calls the social question, right, in her book On Revolution. And the realm of freedom is never about necessity. Which is why it's the realm of freedom. It's about discussion, argument, contestation, conflict at the level of ideals, of ideas, and that's where truth resides. It resides in that kind of debate and even conflict. But when you subordinate all that, that requires freedom to occur. It requires a space to occur. It cannot be shunted away by saying, no, we can't discuss, we have no time, we need to do this, this is an imperative, this is about necessity. That is where life proves to be a problem politically, I think, for Gandhi. So truth, he's also deliberately ambiguous. He'll say things like, it's not that God is truth, but truth is God. like, well, what the hell does that mean exactly? And I think one of the things he means is that truth is the fundamental principle, is the principle of value. Truth is God. He refuses to say that God is true, but what is true is in fact God. It is the ultimate value, and it is counterposed to this logic of life, which is, in his view, because of the history he's tracked, is about necessity, emergency, closing up the realm of freedom. In terms of rights, it's one of the things, as I said, he wants to do is to say, look, sovereignty belongs to individuals. It doesn't belong to states. And what does it, how can we think about a situation in which the individual is sovereign? Well, first by refusing, right? And this is the Gandhian thing, where you say, I'm not going to cooperate with the colonial state. Step one. Step two, I will disobey it. Step three, I'll whatever, right? So once you do that, it's not about formal declarations of independence. It's an existential act. Once you refuse, you're already sovereign, even if your country is not yet free. It's immediate. You have recovered your sovereignty. This is also part of his critique of you. Those you deal with the medical field, you will find it amusing, where he criticizes doctors and lawyers. Right. So he'll say about doctors that, look, the modern medical profession is entirely a colonial. It's all about colonial accreditation and all the rest. And what happens in modern medicine is that it imposes the authority of the medical practitioner through the state, supported by the state, on colonized citizens. And he gives a very homely example of the kind he likes. He says, I have indigestion, I overeat, I have indigestion, I go to a doctor, I get a pill, I feel much better, and then I overeat again because I know I can get rid of my indigestion. In that way, you lose your agency over yourself. You become dependent upon drugs and the whole industry that backs it, and the state's accreditation. The thing to do is to reclaim power control over yourself. That doesn't mean you're not interested in health or you never take medicine, obviously, but you must not allow these kinds of technologies and the medical profession in the colonial state to actually literally rob you of what ends up being your political freedom as well, right? And lawyers similarly, So they're sort of mad, but so that on the one hand. But on the other hand, of course, he's not, because after all, he's fighting for an India which has equality under the law, which has rights, which has all those things. So in a way, what I think he's interested in is how, and this is where the example I just gave of the doctor becomes important, how do you, within, let's say, a generic liberal state, because he doesn't have an alternative to it. He knows that there's an international order. The point is, how do you actually allow for social relations within such a state to be autonomous of it, so that you can preserve sovereignty, that people and individuals can preserve their own sovereignty. So how do you limit the reach of these technologies and state-like processes, not in order to live in dreadful unhygienic conditions and squalor and all the rest, but precisely in order to protect your sovereignty, and therefore to engage more effectively with the state, not to withdraw from it. So I think it's a quandary for him, because he thinks that the logic of liberalism is one that has its place, but it can never, without becoming despotic, really define all of social relations. For instance, he thinks that sacrifice, which he's so, he's kind of morbidly interested in, is key because it defines all our most intimate relations. Parents and children sacrifice for each other, lovers sacrifice for each other, family members sacrifice. It doesn't have to sacrifice your life, So if you were to extend the liberal logic of interest, that everyone is to be conceived of as interest, to every bit of social life, you would have hell, all right? Families would not hold together. There would be no lovers. We see this in the news all the time, children suing their parents and all the rest, where the language of the state and the law comes to inform and subtend every social relationship. So Gandhi thinks that is, A, it's impossible, but B, even if it were possible, it would be deeply despotic. You shouldn't have this. So how do you preserve that? Those things that are already there. So in that sense, he didn't think that he was an idealist. He says, no, look, we indubitably know that people behave like this. And people are acculturated into behaving like this. This is part, and it's not India, it's universal in that sense, right? It's all over the world. You have these ideals, which are often based on sacrifice of your time, of your effort, of your money, of your life, if it comes to it. That really cannot be taken over by liberal ideas of rights and interests and all of these things, which he thinks are based on property anyway. That rights, the fundamental right is the right to property, and your life seen as a property, right? This is John Locke. And interests similarly are based on property. So here we're taking the stuff that comes out of capitalism and making a big kind of ethical thing out of it. Well, of course, it's interesting. But what really makes us human is that ability, it's duty and sacrifice, and moving beyond all the things that I spoke about. So that's how he would like to balance out, So you have the realm of the law and the rights and all the rest, and you can make claims on it. But he would also like to think about in an anarchistic way. He called himself a philosophical anarchist, right? So how do you get to be an anarchist in what had to be what eventually was a quite centralized state, right? That he was responsible for creating in some fashion.
It's wonderful. Maybe we should let some other folks.
Any questions? Yeah.
I have a question for Faisal.
You happen to have your own mic, which is
I,
good.
I came prepared.
Okay, first Aaron, then Wendy.
So yesterday, I'd like to enlist your help with something. Yesterday, we had a long and very rich conversation whose outcome was something along the lines of a dilemma that we, all of us, who've gathered here in this room have, which is to say that on the one hand, we want accountability for very urgent violations of things that ought to be happening and aren't. On the other hand, we're very uncertain, or at least there's a debate, I think, both inside of us and between us, about whether it's really possible to have accountability given the existing structures. And so there's a we're kind of at a point of decision as to whether it's an accountability situation in which, as you pointed out in our discussion at dinner last night, you're actually preserving and endorsing the existing institutional structures. If we're demanding accountability, we're assuming that there is accountability to be had in the current social order. Or is it a revolutionary situation? Do we need to sacrifice the social order, to use the terminology that you introduced from Gandhi, in order to achieve justice? So I guess what I'd like to ask you is, as an historian, how you think history can be of service to us. One of the things that was striking to me about your talk is that there's a kind of debate between Arendt and Gandhi about revolution, right? Arendt is saying, well, there's this new vision of humanity in which life is the absolute value, and it comes about because of the bomb. So it's like it's a world historical phenomenon over which we have no control. And Gandhi is saying, no, you did this, you want this, and I want something different. I want to change it, I want to upend it, I want to sacrifice it. These are two different historical visions and two different sort of ways of taking lessons from history. And I wonder if, in your thinking about this, you can kind of shed light on this dilemma which we have in this, more sort of operational vein. Do we go to, international, venues of international justice and say, we need to hold these people accountable? How do we decide between that course of action and the more radical course of action, which is to say, we need to demand that these structures be dismantled?
Yeah, that's interesting. In a way, it connects up to your question, which I didn't address on punishment. Because in a way, both Arendt and Gandhi are anti-revolutionary figures. Arendt is very critical of the French Revolution. She's very enamored of the American Revolution, or at least some parts of it. Gandhi calls himself an anarchist, but he's not he doesn't want to, and he would, he has an idea that, India should be a completely decentralized, it would never happen, village from the villages up and all the rest, but he never really makes any effort to put it together despite the fact of being the kind of mascot at the end of his life, as he was, of the Indian National Congress. But I think, what's interesting is that, well, two things. One, something I said just earlier, which is how do you take what already exists, which is what Gandhi always does, and develop it, which is why he's not an idealist, right? So he'll take what are our normal human relations, what already exists, what is there, indubitably, we all know, wherever it comes from. What do we make of this? How do we push this? That's where he's starting from. So you start from someplace. You don't start from some outer space, And he's very, very intent on this, precisely because it can't be just kind of abstract global thing, It must know its own history, You must do your duty and all the rest. The second thing has to do with, again, then this gets to the question of punishment. It's our conversation last night about BDS, right? So in terms of accountability, for Gandhi, it would never be punitive, all right? It would always be, and that's where truth is crucial. It's always about converting your enemy. Now, you might think this is a terribly idealistic situation, but remember, as I said, he's not a pacifist, so it's not like he's entirely against war either. But even a war might become a situation in which nonviolence, that the war might create a possibility for nonviolence. And I'll give you an example of that. So his point is, and this is, as I said, our conversation about BDS, and we were talking about the boycott, divestment, sanctions policy on Israel, and I was just there in January and I had to talk about it. And it was very interesting because I pointed out how fascinating I thought the fact that these terms, especially sanctions, but also boycott, which are taken from the arsenal of international law as coming through British imperialism, right? That's what the Royal Navy did, right? Sanctions and boycott, that's what Britain could do because of the Navy, right? You blockade. This is a politics of blockade. Of course, it doesn't work like that in BDS. I'm just talking about the commonality of the terms and where they come from. So there, and then very often in the pro-BDS people, the argument is fascinating because it's always about, look, the state needs to be doing this according to the provisions of international law, but it's not doing it, so we will step in and work for the state. We supplement the state. And my point is, isn't that a bit problematic? I mean, on the one hand, you're critical of sanctions on Cuba and I don't know what, and then you want sanctions on some other place, and you're willing to act in the name of the state. So you're not even willing to adopt autonomy in your it's like the deferral of the state sovereignty on you. That there must be other ways of thinking about this. And the only real example is South Africa, which I'm not sure is even an entirely legitimate example of this, because it deprives the South African people of their own freedom. It's like, no, we did it. We did boycott, divestment, and sanctions. So obviously this is a crude retelling of it, but if we were to take, say, a Gandhian perspective, because Gandhi did non-cooperation. It's called non-cooperation. It's not called boycott, right? And he fought about the use of the word boycott. It was a boycott, and he burns Manchester milk cloth and all the rest. You stop using it. But what is its purpose? Its purpose is it doesn't come from international law. It's not punitive. It's about truth. It's about converting the other, and that's what truth in a way means. You have a kind of debate, even if it's not a sitting in a room and like us, it's not this kind of thing. It's facts on the ground. All kinds of things are happening. That makes the possibility of truth. That creates truth as a possibility. Your aim should be to convert the enemy, not to punish the enemy. So that's one way of thinking about accountability, which is not punitive and which doesn't draw from this whole history of sanctions and blockades and all the rest, which I think actually weakens the BDS case rather than strengthens it. All right. In terms of the international law dimension, Gandhi, in 1948, India and Pakistan became independent in 1947. 48, they went to war. And Gandhi and Nehru took the case to the UN, and it's still there. I mean, the Kashmir, it's not been resolved. And Gandhi was sort of interestingly prescient. He says, it's good to have the UN, of course, but, we have to prevent it from working like the old imperial state. Because the imperial state was also international in this manner, right? And the imperial state worked by making itself into a kind of neutral third-party arbiter by saying, look, Hindus, Muslims, I don't know, in North Indians, South Indians, you guys are all interests. It creates interests, and then it arbitrates between them. Right? For Gandhi, this just entrenches interests, and that this arbitration is incapable of resolving any issue, ever. And because it's about mediation, what you need is a direct engagement. Now, hopefully, the direct engagement is non-violent in the kind of debate, etc., techniques of conversion that I was describing, but it can, on occasion, also be violent if there is no other option. So Gandhi is against UN intervention. He thinks, basically, once you get the UN in here, it's going to be this arbitration thing. No problem can ever be resolved. It's just the use of force that will do it. And it can only tap down violence temporarily. That is certainly true of this event, of this case, Kashmir. Forget it, right? And that, rather than that, direct, unmediated discussions are preferable, and if not, even a war. He's for the war, by the way, right? He thinks that the war is bad, it's terrible, but in this case, it might actually open a place for discussion. The war is meant to open a place for discussion. And indeed, if I might hazard this, India-Pakistan war, now they've become impossible because of nuclear arms, but India-Pakistan wars until now have always led to progress in diplomacy, right? That's what has, and they've been, without recommending war, but they've been textbook wars, right? They've been fought outside, in every case, outside civilian areas, apart from the Bangladesh war where there was genocide. And that, it's interesting, there India is one of the earliest countries to do this humanitarian intervention, right? In 1971, they go in and they create Bangladesh out of East Pakistan, right? So, but the India-Pakistan wars have been highly civilized, fought outside civilian areas. They often knew each other, the officer class, because of coming from colonial times. And very little can be said against them, and they have always progressed the relations between those countries. Whereas the UN mandated stuff has always languished and has never moved an inch. And that's Gandhi's point. Unmediated relations, hopefully non-violent. If not, you might have to go through an interregnum of violence, though you try not to. But that might create an opportunity for non-violence and therefore truth.
So Faisal, can I push you just because I want to pick up where Aaron, this idea of conversion, it's interesting. So instead of like suing people, et cetera, you try and give the opportunity for conversion. But even if you look at Gandhi's own success, the conversion takes place after World War II when Britain is exhausted, grossly in debt. America's, reached a much higher level of power and is able to really tighten the screws and say, no, this has to end to open up business paths for its own people, et cetera. So, when you're dealing with these kinds of, when you're dealing with the IMF and the World Bank and these global institutions, imperialist institutions, and you're seeing this relation, but those dynamics have not changed. Is the only form of the local then to sue these people in local courts or hold them accountable? Like how does that play into this? Because the idea of conversion, like sitting down and saying, oh, World Bank and IMF, let's not do this. This isn't a good thing. There's no direct contact with these people. They sit in a different place than the people that they're lording over, and it's so you could do something to the British because you could boycott them because you were there and they were there, and you could look them in the eyes and do it. They could put you in jail and your people would be marching outside the jail. There's none of that happening. So it's exactly that the local context is completely removed from this. But yet there is this power dynamic. So how do you address that using this language?
I mean, it does happen, whether it's the Occupy movements or whether it is, those great protests that happen, G20 meetings and all the rest. So you can arguably see those as Gandhian. Whether they result in anything is unclear. Sometimes they do, but sometimes the effect is seen only a few years hence. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if the Arab Spring demonstrations, we actually see the effects of it in some years' time. There's been a fundamental transformation, even though superficially, apart from Tunisia, it all looks like dreadful, not superficially, it's true, dreadful dictatorships, right? So there's one thing, that stuff does happen, and it very often draws explicitly upon Gandhian interventions. But you can also think about them in quite local, kind of local situations as well, right? Now, obviously, the whole thing about Gandhi, he's not saying that you should immediately go out and fast to death or, gather around some place in large numbers and refuse to. There has to be negotiations. He's a lawyer, it's like it goes there step by step by step by step. You don't just immediately go to the thing. Can it happen at a global level with these, even with Britain? You're right what you say about that. But in a way, the ground was prepared long before among the British citizenry itself, where Gandhi was a very popular figure at the end of, he was a celebrity. People were coming out and see when he was going into London and all that. And the ground had been prepared internationally as well through Gandhian nonviolence, right? It had a kind of moral status, rightly or wrongly. Gandhi was no saint. That was extraordinary and unprecedented, which also allowed Britain to disengage without humiliation. That is also a crucial Gandhian thing, right? You don't humiliate your enemy. You allow them, so Britain could disengage in the most friendly way possible. And the results are extraordinary. There has been occasionally there's a small kerfuffle, but the relations between Britain and India have been pretty good since then, despite hundreds of years of colonial experience. It's an extraordinary thing to have happened. And I wouldn't be surprised if the Gandhian move, so one has to judge the consequences slightly differently. They're not necessarily immediate, and they are to be seen in the context that makes for the thing. But in terms of the global issue, you're right, the nuclear war, when the atom bomb is exploded in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Gandhi goes silent for 2 weeks because he doesn't know how to deal with this. Because his whole politics has been about it's public. In order, as you were saying, in order to convert your enemy, you have to make a spectacle of yourself, in a sense, right? It has to be visible to the enemy and to others. The nuclear bomb doesn't allow that to happen. It's immediate. It's done from a great height. What are the Japanese people, what are they going to, suppose they even knew it was coming? So he sees that this poses a real challenge to his idea. Eventually, he'll say quite paradoxical, strange things that, even if the Japanese people had known, they should have gone about their daily lives as if nothing were happening. And, the love that was in their hearts, this sort of thing would have reached up to the American pilot and all the rest. But then his conclusion finally is that even if this process of conversion isn't working, it might work posthumously. It might not work now, point one. The second point is, whether it works or not is irrelevant, because the nuclear bomb tells us that non-violence is really the only way out, that you cannot have a war under these conditions any longer. So whether the Gandhian thing, he saves his principle, if not his method.
Yeah, two things I wanted to pick up. One was, as you were talking about the just war, and then you positioned, the in and out groups, and therefore groupthink. And it made me think about groupthink in the accountability frameworks that we're exploring, and the in-group and the inhuman out-group. So just a reflection maybe with you there. And the second thing was, as you talked about humanity as a subject that only comes to the fore when we're faced with extinction, and therefore the accountability that we saw with the HIV/AIDS against, say, cholera, against, say, TB. So it was a really interesting axis between groupthink and that sense of extinction, and how that's impacting on the accountability frameworks that we're kind of looking at in this global healthcare. And I just wanted to tease away at those 2 points, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I can. It's very interesting, as you say. And in a way, even though I've been banging on about Gandhi, he was a man of his time. And he, like Arendt, had some inkling of the new global arena in which we now all operate. And they were even prescient about it. But I don't think either of them actually give us very much more in the way of how to address the situation we are in. Because some of it becomes sort of quite trite, go local. Okay, it's very nice, farmers markets and all this kind of stuff, but it doesn't really, because one knows that the issue is a global issue. It has to be addressed at a global level. And how do you do that? Do you have a world government? Well, someone like Gandhi or indeed Arendt would be against it, though people like Einstein were for it. One world or none and all the rest, because of the nuclear thing. And precisely because the language of emergency privileges time, or the lack of time, it just cuts out our traditional, our inherited democratic and liberal institutions, which presume time for discussion, time for thought, time for debate, this is also Gandhi's quandary in the nuclear war. There's no time, So how do you, either you go a completely technocratic way, which is undemocratic by definition, right? And that's sort of increasingly happening, right? you know, the Elaine Scarry here at Harvard wrote this quite interesting piece in the aftermath of 9/11, where she said that those people on that flight that went down in Pennsylvania, the passengers there actually acted. She saw it as a kind of American Republic in the air, because they took matters into their own hands. And that flight, of course, was prevented from wherever it was meant to go, to the White House or someplace, right? So they died. It was an act of sacrifice. But for her, it was because they talked about it, even though there appeared to be no time. They communicated secretly, and they tried to overpower the hijackers. They did. But they all died as a consequence, though they saved something also. She said she put that apart, and she said, look, this is the Republic functioning. What's happening on the ground is emergency provisions and measures where no discussion is possible, where laws are then passed that, you're going to shoot down any airline that seems to be doing strange things without asking any questions, where the people on the other airlines, of course, they were prisoners. But so she said, look, I'd rather have, in both cases, it's sacrificial and violent, but I'd rather have this, because even in a situation where we are told there was no time, there was nothing, they did something. So in a way, the quandary is, how do you actually put time back in a highly mediated society, technology society, in which it is constantly being eliminated, without making it kind of robotic discussion where it's a protocol of this happens, then this happens, then this happens, and decision is made without anyone. Right. And it's insoluble in some ways. So I wouldn't speculate on. Though, if you think, and I'm sorry for being so long-winded, if you think about something like the EU, it's a very interesting, slightly parlous at the moment, order, but it's fascinating because it is an order with no sovereignty. I mean, we've never seen any such thing before. It's much more than a trade pact that's not NAFTA or anything like that, right? And it has many annoying things about it. On the other hand, it's extraordinary because it is a model of an international order, a kind of miniature version of it, that can work without vesting sovereignty and therefore decision in one place. It requires time, right? And it works without sovereign power. Now, you could say that NATO, in effect, serves as the sovereign power of the EU, though now, the Germans are building they're building a European army and all the rest. So how do you actually? We talk about how it's kind of bureaucratic and incompetent and all the rest, but the virtue of it is that it deliberately builds in time. It deliberately builds in discussion, and therefore, at least potentially, it can become a model of, as it were, a realm of freedom. So all hope is not lost.
You were talking about Gandhi, and I'm interested that I'm supposing he wouldn't have been a big fan of universal health coverage, built on the sort of the right to health. Do you think that had a sort of profound impact on sort of Congress's thinking over recent years in India, and maybe is one of the reasons that the right to health and health care doesn't ever seem to be a big issue in Indian politics, particularly in sort of general elections? It just never seems to come up as a theme. Do you see the role of Gandhi in that?
That's very interesting. I haven't thought about that. I mean, in general, Congress didn't go in a Gandhian direction. In some respects, they did. In foreign policy, they often did, at least in Nehru's period. I mean, would Gandhi have been for, he was for equality of opportunities, of course, and equal rights as well under the law, all right? So he always supported equal rights for men and women, for instance, under the law, though he was sometimes quite doubtful of the intentions involved. For instance, he said there was an interesting debate between him and a woman who was one of his disciples, who wanted to entrench, equality to inheritance for women. And Gandhi said, of course I'm for it. But I also can't help feeling that this is terrible because you're arguing for property and property rights, And the great thing about women, and he said, remember, most men and most people in India at this point don't have any property at all. So you're arguing for a right which is actually for a very small group of people. That's one thing. The other thing is, by granting such rights to everyone, you entrench them and you make the regime into a regime of property run by propertied interests. And everyone becomes an interest in that way. And that's terrible. On the other hand, I know that, I cannot tolerate unequal treatment. So he's unable to work his way out institutionally of that, apart from, as I said before, trying to organize a kind of alternative society in his own ashrams and all the rest. So he might well have had a similar view on rights of healthcare, because he was, as I said, very interested in health. He was constantly experimenting on himself, on others, like, how do you, diet, weight, all of these things. And he made notes and all the rest. He was really keen on that. He was not anti-scientific, So whether Congress, I'm inclined to think, sadly, that in a way it comes out of political culture in India that is really uncaring in general of people, even people who vote for them, of their rights, opportunities, and health. I mean, we see this in UP, in the most populous state in India. Recently, you may have read a government hospital that was, 60 to 80 babies died because they didn't pay the oxygen bill, even after repeated reminders, and then they've arrested the doctor and the director of the hospital who had nothing to do with the payment of the bill. It created a stir in the press, but nothing has happened. They just arrested the wrong people. The government is not in the dock. It just goes on, and these are very poor people who goes to a government hospital. You don't want to go because you tend to die there. So the facilities are terrible, and they're poor people. And the new India, the post-liberalization India, has made remarkable achievements, but it's also led to a society. It's intensified a society which has always been deeply hierarchical and uncaring. And in a way, that's also the kind of thing Gandhi wanted to address. How do you deal with this kind of society? And is the state the best way of doing it? So I don't have an answer to your specific question, apart from saying very sadly that it has a long history, that kind of thing.
Yeah, Faisal. I just got done living in India for 8 years, and one of the most striking things for me being there was this different narrative you get about Gandhi when you're in India, as opposed to the one we get in the West, and particularly about the role of the nonviolent movement in winning Indian independence. There's a striking number of people over there in India who think Gandhi was kind of a wimp, and they actually preferred the violent approach against the British. And there were people who wanted to do violence against the British. There were people who did do the violence against the British. There were people who were planning on doing a lot more violence against British. So yes, the UK was, greatly weakened by World War II. Yes, the nonviolent movement was powerful politically. But what about the role of violence? I mean, and the role it played in the British decision to get out?
There was violence. Whether it was sufficient to drive out the British is another question in a disarmed population, as Gandhi also noted. But, his argument, so we don't know. In fact, Gandhi realized quite early on that one of the reasons the British were there and had been there for so long is because, as he put it, we want them here. We like their trade. We like what they do for us. And we like our own depoliticization. And then we fight amongst each other because we have no responsibilities, because it all belongs to the British. So we can have internecine quarrels, and we know they're there to solve them for us. We have been made into interests because we like the goods that they bring to us. So what he understands is that there is actually not that much passion in India to fight against the British, despite the fact that there were terrorist groups and all the rest. There's only one armed, after the 19th century, after the middle of the 19th century, uprising against the British. Well, there's a mutiny in the Navy, like 1946, quite late. But there's the INA, the Indian National Army, which is supported by Hitler on the one hand and the Japanese during the Second World War on the other, right? those are the only two armed, ineffectual, the INA. The mutiny is a more interesting thing, but it gets nipped in the bud. So I don't know whether that would have succeeded, but in any case, Gandhi's argument against it is principle, because he says, look, if we oust them by violence, will become just like them. Do you really want a state in which you just replace white faces with brown faces? If you achieve this independence by violent means, you will have to maintain it by violent means. Your violence will become part of your politics, inevitably. And rather than that, if you just want to replace the British, then just have the British. They know how to do it. Why do you want to do that? You need to do something quite new. You don't just want to become like Britain is at home. What you want to do is experiment with a different way of governing, a different way of thinking about politics that the British might be attracted by as well. And that's another example of conversion, where you basically say to the British, and he didn't want them to leave, by the way. He said the British are as Indian as anyone else. They can live here, but we must have a democratic country. It's not a racialized debate for Gandhi. So how do you actually think about something new that might even be attractive to the British themselves? So that is his, it's not about violence and, non-violence is good and violence is terrible, because as I said, he doesn't mind the occasional war. But what kind of state, what kind of society, what kind of politics do we want?
Roger. Well, first, thank you for such an interesting and provocative early morning discussion. And Roger, I want to salute you also
for willingly entering this lion's den of humanitarian terrorists. And and actually, there's uncomfortable truths to that. I want to reference a book that came out more than 20 years ago by Mikao Matua, who was at Harvard, helped start the Harvard Human Rights Program. But speaking of the African experience, called the human rights movement a missionary movement, with real parallels in the sense that no one working in humanitarian or very few have an attitude of violence and we want to take from you. But it was the soft imperialism that prepared the way for military, political intervention and conquest. And we do see that still. And when I was teaching in Pakistan, actually, we had a joke among the students of forming a human rights Taliban to deal with the other Taliban. But again, the Taliban came out as an idealistic student movement to get rid of corruption. It was not, we have certain images now, but so turning that to a question, it's a slightly unrelated question, but you talked about duties. Gandhi, it's his famous response, and duties and rights. We talked a little yesterday at how human rights has a problem in that it's rights disembodied from duties, no implementation enforcement. So we talk about the problem of accountability, but law, normal law, operational law is rights and duties combined. I have a right, you, the government, someone has a duty to either fulfill it or not stop me from exercising it. So what does a human rights system of duties look like? I think that's, this one, we don't like this system of disembodied rights. But what would a system that was formed, first of all, on duties be? And I think one caution people have about that is the traditional mode of duties is the religious notion, duties to God, and not so much duties to each other. And or is it duty to self in terms of the notion of sacrifice? So I want to know how you would look at that.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. I mean, in a way, one of the people who writes about duties in terms of how they might be institutionalized is Honora O'Neill. O'Neill, yes, I think that's the name. But in terms of, I haven't thought about how you might institutionalize duties. Gandhi, for instance, doesn't think about the institutionalization of them because he's interested in individuals and social relations outside institutions and and how these ideas of duty can be brought from the outside in. So they're not defined institutionally. They come from the outside, and therefore they represent the sovereignty of the outside, of individuals and of societies. In that sense, he's, despite my going on about the importance of politics, he's also quite interested in limiting the political himself, not abolishing it, obviously. So he wouldn't necessarily have an institutionalized vision of duties, partly also because for him, duties are not generic. Talk about context. They're highly contextualized and they can only be defined by people themselves. So to know your duty, dharma is the Sanskrit word. So to know your duty, you need to know who you are. Are you a man or are you a woman? Are you an adult or a child? What's your situation? What's your class? All of these things going. Whereas necessarily legal forms are stripped of context, right? Because they have to be universal in this fashion. Which is why they can be so glaringly unequal. To be universal, they have to be contextless in a way. Everyone has the right. It doesn't matter who they are. Which is why then you need to supplement them by doing things like affirmative action in India reservations, right? Which goes slightly outside the logic of the universal rights, because you need to make sure that people who have been historically disadvantaged and continue to be disadvantaged have a privilege, not a right, right? A non-universal privilege. So it's interesting how in institutional terms, the context only gets filled in by exceptions, by privileges. And affirmative action is a crucial one, obviously. For Gandhi, this would not be necessary if people outside institutions already knew their duties in contextualized terms. So in a way, it's a non-conversation. But if you look at the Indian Constitution, the universality of rights is limited or exceptionalized by by affirmative action which is always meant to be temporary in nature, but of course it continues indefinitely because the ideal is always the contextless universal, right? Which never comes. So it's a nice economy. It's a kind of back and forth where you have the contextless universality of rights. It cannot be of duties in some fashion, in some ways, which are dependent on context. And on the other hand, you have an exception to it. So it does happen. And the question institutionally is, how do you make it happen more without completely subsuming universality by having privileges everywhere? So in a way, that's my... Yeah.
Specific cases within a universal framework.
Yeah, it's so the only legal way I know of doing it is this way, by making exceptions. But they are not unproblematic, and also they give rise to acrimony. Certainly in India, also here. And so, it's something that's worth thinking about. But in terms of talking about Pakistan, in a way, Pakistan more recently has shown in the figure of Abdul Sattar Eidi, who was this extraordinary man who died not so long ago, and here is this kind of strangely Gandhian figure in some ways, because he was the most important humanitarian figure in Pakistan, right? How did he begin? I mean, he ran an ambulance service, but initially for picking up dead bodies for in Karachi, the kind of internecine ethnic struggles. So he focused on death, not life, right? The dignity of death. And it was a massive thing. It made his reputation. You need to treat bodies with dignity. You need to pick them up. You need to bury them. You need to give them the appropriate ceremonies. And from there, so you move from that duty, which is not about life, which is not, the person's already dead. There's no emergency kind of thing there, You move from that to dealing with life. Then there are schools and there's this and there's all of the other stuff that he did. And he did it entirely outside the state. Volunteers, and I can't think of a more Gandhian figure in a way, though he doesn't talk about nonviolence in the same, he didn't talk about it in the same, deeply pious Muslim, all right, from the same state as Gandhi from Gujarat, right? So he would have certainly known about him more intimately in some ways than others in India would. So in a way, he serves as a very nice example of the possibilities of that form of action. He sets up a very large, as you know, organization, again, outside institutions, outside formal institutions. Yes, yeah. Exactly, yeah. So there's provision, and of course that creates its own problems, as we know, with NGOs, which relieve the state of its own responsibilities and therefore privatize in some ways in an unaccountable way. At least the state is meant to be accountable to its voters, whereas NGOs often aren't. They're accountable to donors. So there are problems there also, but it's a very interesting example of the kind of thing I've been talking about.
One last comment from Tom, and then we'll...
Exactly on these lines, I was just wondering whether or not the thinking and the research library put together at Indiana University by Eleanor and Vincent Ostrom was of some interest to you, because she looked directly, this is more on the public policy side, but also relates to law and social interactions and institutional provision. But she put together this enormous library on common pool resource management that looked at how people, I think the good news is that people are doing what you're talking about all over the world all the time, just not necessarily on the large stage that we're talking about here. So how she identified 7 or 8 or 9 kind of common institutional design principles, which is a super poli-sci way of saying, well, what are people doing in common when people are sharing resources, but there's a very complex interlocked system of responsibilities, duties, as well as kind of some notion of rights. But sometimes there's a legal component, sometimes there's drawing rights for a fishery or a forest. They have this unbelievable compendium of case studies from Japan to Turkey to India to South America that they've compiled, looking at where does it work, where does it not work, where does it seem like there's some sort of approaches in common that make sense. And so if anyone hasn't read her work, Governing the Commons kind of pulls all that together.
No, thank you for that. As it turns out, I was just in Bloomington earlier this week at the University of Indiana, and I think you're right. I mean, I have not consulted the archive, but I certainly know the work, and it's fascinating. And as you say, there's a lot of this sort of thing happening. It's a question of how do you maximize its effect, and how does it move on from being more than a local enterprise without losing itself altogether and becoming part of this gargantuan international institutions. So again, it's a debate between the kind of small is good, which has severe limitations, and the necessity of global action, because it is necessary. But we haven't quite figured out, this was my point about Al-Qaeda, by the way, that they're operating in a global arena which has no politics of its own. That's how they're able to operate, because they call for such a thing in a phantasmatic and awful way. There is no global politics. And our international order is really unable to address, as we see with climate change. The international order just does not have at the moment the capacity to address it. So how do we do it without simply building a kind of super, another superstructure, a super state? So it's a continuing problem. But I do think that in any case, whatever happens, you need a whole series, from the local upwards. It can't just be one thing, and that too would be a Gandhian thing, that you would need. As he puts it so elegantly, it's a distinction between a pyramid, which he doesn't like, top down, and what he calls an oceanic circle, where things move outwards from very, very local bases.
Well, Faisal, what a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful discussion. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you.